The China threat to India is both real and unreal. It is real in the sense that China is unashamedly expansionist and a land grabber, not too unlike the mafiosi in cities which uses hooligans and street enforcers to grab land from unsuspecting citizens. That, in one sense, is the real level of China if you can ignore all its talk and aspirations of being the most or close to becoming the most formidable power in the world after America. And China does that on the completely neurotic pretext of imperial ancient folklore and tradition that once upon a time its landmass stretched far and wide in all directions and the sea. The hegemonic claims of China could be straight out of a kung fu fantasy movie, something like a crouching tiger and hidden dragon. That is how far gone is China in its constant attrition battles, not only with India, but also with Taiwan, Japan, Philippines, and so many other countries in the Asia Pacific region and South China Sea. We must live with this unreal reality and deal with it. And that fact will not change, at least not in the foreseeable future. The threat from China is also unreal, as I said in the beginning, and I say that because it exists in our minds, especially in those of our policy makers. And according to me, this kind of threat is more dangerous than the one where China makes a bid for land grab. I will explain by what I mean by this hypothesis in a minute, but first, a warm welcome to all viewers of the CAA show. CAA, as all of you know, is Conversations and Analysis, and my name is Juggi Bhasin. To watch this video podcast, press the big red subscriber button on your screen, and subscription is, of course, completely free. Now, let us first understand the real threat from China and how to deal with it. The fact of the matter is, and I say this with all seriousness, that it is highly unlikely that China has the stomach to wage a real hot war with India, or for that matter, with any country with which they are locked in land and maritime disputes. I will repeat this. Despite their massive spend on their armed forces and development and expansion, they don't have the grit to wage war, like for instance the Russians have done in Ukraine and taken significant losses. One only needs to take a quick history check and determine China's track record in waging a hot war. The last real war China fought was in 1979 with Vietnam, in which they got a pasting from the Vietnamese. Even as recently as in the Taiwan crisis, for a few days they tried to blockade maritime access to Taiwan and they held live firing drills near Taiwan landmass. But did they make any attempt to invade Taiwan or prevent Nancy Pelosi's plane from landing in Taipei? We all know the answer. In Galwan also, they got a bloody nose from India in a skirmish where they seriously miscalculated that India would ever hit back, even with one-third force level vis-a-vis the Chinese in that sector. The only kind of war the Chinese have been waging all around and perhaps even winning it is the bluff and bluster kind of war. They are masters at playing games with your mind, projecting their power and force levels to terrifying levels. Very much like the mafiosi I talked about who hold the threat of violence without perhaps carrying it out. Check out Coppola's masterpiece movie, The Godfather, to know what I'm talking about. The Chinese operate in the same way. In contrast, the Americans and now even the Russians rush in everywhere, whereas they say even angels fear to tread. Even in 1962, as many war historians and scholars have pointed out, if Nehru had in time galvanized the Indian Air Force and given it orders to attack, we could perhaps have been saved from the 1962 debacle. But now in the present, we live a different reality. Our armed forces can, anytime in a real conflict, convert the Chinese imperial kung fu fantasy in a nightmare for them. But for all that to happen, our policymakers and lawmakers, and the elite in our country, they must exorcise the Chinese threat, that unreal threat, from their minds. Only then will we finally bury the 1962 ghost from our consciousness. And to do that, we need to keep an important factor in mind. And that is that in a conflict, the more prosperous nation, which in our case is obviously China, that nation has more to lose in a conflict. The armed forces of the richer country lose the edge and the hunger for sacrifice and glory as time goes past. In the Indian armed forces, the soldier can never return to his village if he does not uphold the honor of his regiment. Can China say the same of its soldiery? In the 1967 Six Days Arab-Israeli War, Israel, a single country, defeated the combined armed might of the entire Arab world because it faced an existential threat. I have no doubt in my mind that India would operate in the same way when faced with an existential threat from a better armed adversarial China, if it came to that. The need of the hour is for our policymakers and bureaucrats to disabuse the dragon breathing fire from their minds and give the army a free hand to deal with these skirmishes as they see fit and not what the politicians dictate to them. And on another note, it is time we publicly announce that we are discarding the defensive, no first use nuclear deterrent policy. We must match China psychologically, tit for tat, in these mind battles and not let go. No more handshake with Xi, even if he were to come to the G20 summit in India, which seems very unlikely. Tough posturing is not an interim tactic. It is a long-term strategy to realize valuable objectives. We have to maintain that posture with China for as long as it takes, economically, militarily, and certainly politically, till real change is witnessed on the ground. But before we do that, and I mean in all seriousness, our lawmakers and politicians should attend a counseling course how best to exorcise the Chinese demon from their minds. And at the same time, bring in a policy of retaliation for every provocation from China. A retaliation that is unflinching, continuous, and unsparing. Because that is the only language China understands and respects. And so, on this note, I come to the end of this particular episode of the CAA show. I hope you really enjoyed our show. And if you like the CAA show, do subscribe to us. And on this note, it's goodbye and cheers from my end.